James Carter, a 72-year-old man, walked calmly through the mall's corridors with steady, deliberate steps. His face, marked by time and a few wrinkles, carried a peaceful expression, almost serene. He wore a simple, yet elegant suit, and his thin-rimmed glasses sat comfortably on his nose, giving him an air of quiet wisdom. Accompanied by his 3-year-old granddaughter, Mia, he felt a simple, pure joy. It was one of those calm days when life felt lighter, as if time had slowed down, allowing him to savor the little moments. Mia, with her infectious energy, darted ahead of James, hopping from side to side with carefree delight. Her curly hair was styled in a small braid, and she wore a colorful dress that matched her cheerful personality. Every now and then, she would stop to admire the store windows, pointing at toys displayed inside. "Grandpa, look at that teddy bear," Mia exclaimed, her eyes wide with excitement. She had that way of getting lost in the simple things, as if the world was one big adventure. James smiled warmly. He knew moments like these were precious, and he made sure to enjoy them fully. "I see it, sweetheart. We'll get there soon," James replied with a soft smile, adjusting his glasses. They were strolling through one of the city's most luxurious malls. It was a place filled with high-end stores, and the atmosphere blended sophistication with modernity. But for James, the mall was just a place to spend a leisurely day with Mia. No rush, no big plans. James' life had been filled with challenges, and over the years, he had learned to appreciate the simple moments, like Mia's smile or the sound of her laughter when something caught her eye. As James and Mia wandered through the mall, they found themselves in front of a luxury clothing store. The window display featured high-priced garments, stunning accessories, and designer shoes that James knew he'd never be able to afford. But that didn't bother him. He liked admiring beautiful things and imagining a world where everyone had the chance to enjoy such luxuries without judgment. "Let's take a look inside, Mia," James asked, glancing down at his granddaughter, who was now calmer, her attention captured by a colorful accessory display. "Yeah, Grandpa," Mia replied enthusiastically, taking James' hand as he guided her into the store. The store was sleek and modern, with bright lighting casting soft glows on the merchandise. The scent of leather and fine fabrics filled the air, and the impeccably dressed salespeople observed the customers with a watchful eye. Mia was enchanted by a collection of plush toys in a small section of the store for kids, while James casually glanced at the clothing displays. However, as James surveyed the shelves, he suddenly felt a gaze fixed on him. Turning his head, he saw the store security guard, a young man with a stern expression, watching him intently. James didn't think much of it, continuing his stroll with Mia, who was now crouched down near a teddy bear. The security guard, however, didn't take his eyes off James. Something seemed to be bothering the man, though James couldn't understand why. Maybe it was just his imagination, but the scrutiny made him uncomfortable. Just as he bent down to help Mia grab the teddy bear, the security guard approached. "Sir, you need to come with me," the security guard said abruptly, his voice lacking any friendliness. James looked at him in surprise. "Excuse me, is there a problem?" he asked calmly, still holding Mia's hand. He didn't understand what was happening but remained composed, as he always did. "You're being accused of stealing." "Let's go," the security guard replied, offering no further explanation, merely insisting that James follow him. Mia, frightened, looked from the security guard to James, her eyes filling with tears. "Grandpa, what's happening?" Mia asked, concern clear in her voice. "Don't worry, sweetheart," James said softly, gently patting her head. "Everything will be okay. Just follow me, and everything will be sorted out." With a resigned sigh, James followed the security guard to the back of the store, with Mia walking beside him, visibly nervous about the situation. The security guard didn't say another word as they walked, and the tension in the air began to rise. James could sense that something wasn't right, but he knew if he stayed calm, the situation would clear up soon enough. They arrived at the back room, and James was told to sit down, while the security guard stood by his side, still watching him closely. James, however, showed no signs of nervousness. He knew he was being treated unfairly, but he didn't want to escalate things. All he wanted was for the misunderstanding to be cleared up quickly, so he could return to his granddaughter and continue their peaceful day out. James sat in the small, dimly lit back room of the luxury store, his hands folded calmly in his lap as Mia stood next to him, her tiny fingers clutching his sleeve. She was still nervous, her wide eyes flickering between James and the security guard, who continued to stand near the door, watching them closely. The air felt heavy, the silence almost suffocating. James had experienced his fair share of difficult moments in life, but this was different. This felt unjust. Yet he remained composed, knowing that reacting angrily or with fear would only make the situation worse. Mia tugged at his sleeve. "Grandpa, what's happening?" Her voice wavered slightly, a mix of confusion and anxiety. James turned to her and offered a reassuring smile, even though his own heart was heavy with concern. "It's okay, sweetheart," he said softly, stroking her hair gently. "We're just talking to the people here. That's all. I'm sure it'll be over soon." Mia didn't seem fully convinced, but she nodded anyway, her small face looking up at him with trust. He could tell she didn't completely understand what was happening, but the worry in her eyes was enough to make his stomach tighten. He had promised himself that he would protect her, keep her safe, and make sure nothing ever scared her. The security guard's gaze remained fixed on James, his expression unreadable. James, on the other hand, had done nothing to deserve this kind of treatment. He had been shopping with his granddaughter, nothing more. And yet, somehow, he was being accused of stealing. James was well aware of how people like him, older black men, were often treated unfairly in situations like these. He had seen it happen to others, and now it was happening to him. But he wasn't going to let that make him lose his cool. "I need to call my manager," the security guard muttered after a long silence, his voice thick with frustration. As he left the room, James turned to Mia again. "It's okay. We'll be out of here soon," he reassured her. She squeezed his hand in response, though her small face still reflected uncertainty. James wished there was something more he could do to ease her mind. But for now, all he could do was remain calm and wait for this to be resolved. Minutes passed like hours, the silence broken only by the occasional sound of footsteps outside the room. James didn't know what was taking so long. He hadn't done anything wrong. All he wanted was a simple day out with Mia, to give her a memory of their time together. But now, the thought of this unnecessary confrontation upset him, but he pushed it aside. Getting upset wouldn't help. Finally, the door to the back room opened, and the security guard returned, followed by a tall, well-dressed man who exuded authority. This was the store manager, James assumed. The manager's cold gaze swept over James, before his eyes softened slightly when he saw Mia. "I'm very sorry for the confusion," the manager said, his tone more formal than apologetic. "This is all a mistake." James didn't respond immediately, choosing instead to watch the manager closely. It wasn't often that people were quick to apologize in situations like these, especially when they assumed someone was guilty. He remained quiet, waiting to see how this would unfold. The manager cleared his throat, then gestured to the security guard. "You can let him go now." It seems this was all a misunderstanding. James stood slowly, his legs stiff from sitting for so long. He turned to Mia, who had been silently watching the exchange, and bent down to her level. "See? I told you it would be okay," he said, offering a reassuring smile. The security guard, looking embarrassed but not apologetic, stepped back, allowing James and Mia to walk toward the door. As they passed the manager, the man gave them a polite nod, though it lacked genuine warmth. James didn't feel the need for more than that. This had been an unnecessary ordeal, but at least it was over. "Come on, Mia, let's go finish our walk," James said, taking her hand once again. Mia didn't need any further encouragement. She skipped ahead, eager to leave the uncomfortable situation behind her. James followed, his mind still swirling with thoughts of the way he had been treated, but he pushed them aside for now. He had more important things to focus on, like making sure Mia was all right. As they walked back into the main part of the mall, James took a deep breath, feeling the tension in his body finally begin to ease. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. They had been wrongly accused, but they had remained calm and composed. It had been a reminder that things weren't always fair, but sometimes, just sometimes, things would work out on their own. James and Mia continued walking through the mall, the bright lights and shiny storefronts now seeming like distant distractions. The warmth of the sun outside seemed more inviting, as if the air beyond the mall's glass walls held a sense of freedom that the inside no longer offered. James felt a quiet frustration settle deep in his chest, though he didn't want to let it show. Not for Mia. She was too young to understand the complex web of unfairness that could wrap itself around someone simply because of their appearance. "Grandpa, can we go get ice cream?" Mia asked, her voice cutting through the weight of the moment. She tugged on his hand, her eyes lighting up at the mention of ice cream. Her innocence, her simplicity, was a constant reminder of why James needed to keep pushing forward, no matter what. James smiled, his heart softening at her request. "Sure, sweetheart. Ice cream sounds perfect," he replied, adjusting his glasses as he looked ahead. They turned a corner, heading toward the food court, where James knew Mia would find plenty of sweet treats to enjoy. As they neared the escalator, James heard the sound of hurried footsteps behind them. Before he could even glance back, a voice called out, "Mr. Carter." James stopped in his tracks, turning to find a man in a sharp suit and tie approaching. His stride was purposeful, and there was something familiar about him, though James couldn't quite place it. The man stopped just a few feet away, his eyes wide with a mix of surprise and, was that recognition? "Mr. Carter, I don't know if you remember me," the man said, pausing for a moment, clearly flustered. He extended his hand, which James shook with a slight sense of confusion. "Sorry, I don't believe we've met," James replied politely, his tone measured but curious. The man gave a small laugh, clearly embarrassed. "Of course. How could I forget? I'm Sam Richardson, We met several years ago at a charity event downtown. I'm the owner of this mall, he said, his smile suddenly more confident, almost too confident. He glanced over at the security guard, who had followed him, standing at the entrance to the food court, still looking uneasy. Sam's eyes shifted back to James, and this time there was a subtle change in his expression. It was as if he recognized James, not just as a face from an old charity event, but as someone important, someone who had seen and experienced more than most people would ever know. James didn't say anything at first. He simply waited for the man to continue. I owe you an apology, Sam said quickly. I'm deeply sorry for the way my security treated you earlier. I can assure you that wasn't how we conduct ourselves here. Not at all. It was a misunderstanding, and I should have been more involved from the start. James raised an eyebrow, watching as Sam shifted uncomfortably under his gaze. It's fine, James replied, though the words didn't quite match the coldness he felt inside. It wasn't fine, not by any means. But what good would it do to make a scene? Mia, still holding James' hand, looked up at him, sensing the tension in the air. Grandpa, who's this? She asked, her curiosity evident. James bent down to her level, offering her a gentle smile. This is Mr. Richardson's sweetheart. He owns the mall. He's just here to apologize for what happened earlier, he explained softly. Sam smiled at Mia, his eyes softening at the sight of the innocent little girl, a stark contrast to the heavy atmosphere that had been surrounding them just moments before. It's very nice to meet you, young lady, he said, his voice gentler now. Mia, ever the sweet and curious child, offered a small wave, her tiny hand lifting in greeting. Hi, she said with a wide grin, her enthusiasm infectious. James smiled as he straightened up, his gaze now fixed on Sam. The apology, however sincere it seemed, didn't quite reach James' heart. What happened in that store wasn't just an unfortunate accident. It was a product of the biases that still existed all around them, regardless of how polished the apology sounded. I'm sorry for the trouble, Sam continued, his words coming out in a hurry now. I'll make sure this doesn't happen again. You won't be bothered anymore. I promise. James nodded, not trusting his words completely. Thank you, Mr. Richardson, he said, his voice flat but polite. I appreciate the apology, but let's be clear, this shouldn't have happened in the first place. Sam looked taken aback, but he nodded quickly, as if James' words had struck a nerve. Absolutely, he said earnestly. I completely understand. If you need anything, please don't hesitate to let me know. I'll make sure this is addressed. With a final awkward glance at the security guard, Sam turned and hurried off, clearly eager to distance himself from the awkward exchange. James watched him go, feeling a strange mix of relief and frustration. The apology had been offered, but it didn't erase the stain of what had just transpired. Mia, still unaware of the full gravity of the situation, tugged at James' sleeve. Grandpa, can we get ice cream now? She asked again, her voice full of innocence and excitement, oblivious to the heavy emotions her grandfather was carrying. James, more than ready to put the situation behind them, nodded. Of course, sweetheart. Let's go get that ice cream. As they walked toward the food court, James couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. He had been treated like a criminal simply because of his appearance, and while the apology was nice, it didn't change the reality of what had happened. Still, he pushed those thoughts aside for now. He had Mia to focus on. They were still together, and they would finish their day as planned, no matter how much the world around them tried to get in the way. As James and Mia made their way through the food court, the atmosphere seemed to shift. The air, once thick with tension, now felt lighter, though a subtle weight still lingered on James' shoulders. The fluorescent lights above buzzed gently, and the sound of busy conversations mixed with the clinking of trays and the occasional laughter of children. It was a normal afternoon in the mall, but to James, it felt anything but ordinary. Mia tugged at his hand, pulling him toward the ice cream stand. She had already decided on her choice before they even got to the counter. Chocolate chip cookie dough as always. She was a creature of habit, and James loved that about her. He could almost feel her excitement radiating off her as she bounced on her heels, waiting for the server to scoop her treat. The young woman behind the counter smiled warmly at Mia as she handed over the ice cream, and James couldn't help but notice how effortlessly kind she was. In a world that often seemed cold and judgmental, these small moments of kindness stood out. James took a moment to appreciate the simplicity of it all. "Thank you," Mia said, her voice high-pitched and sweet as she took the cup with both hands. James smiled at her enthusiasm, grateful for the distraction the ice cream provided. "You're welcome, sweetheart," the server replied, her voice gentle, as if she sensed the weight that James was carrying. They moved to a nearby table, and James watched as Mia devoured her ice cream with abandon, her small face covered in chocolate stains. Her joy was infectious, and it made James feel a little lighter, like the burden he'd been carrying for the past hour was starting to fade away. "Grandpa, look!" Mia exclaimed between bites, holding up her half-eaten ice cream as if it were some great discovery. "It's so yummy." James chuckled softly, leaning back in his chair. "I'm glad you like it, Mia. You've got chocolate all over your face, though." He reached for a napkin and gently wiped her chin, making her giggle as she squirmed in her seat. Just as he was about to take a bite of his own sandwich, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, his eyes scanning the message from his daughter, Linda. It was a simple text, but one that made his heart skip a beat. "Dad, how's everything going with Mia? Call me when you can." James paused for a moment, letting out a small sigh. Linda had been worried about him since his wife passed away a few years ago. She'd always asked if he was doing okay, if he needed anything, and he appreciated her concern. But there were days when he didn't want to burden her with his problems. He had always prided himself on being strong, the rock of the family. He quickly typed a response. "We're fine, just having a little break. I'll call you later." He hit send and slipped the phone back into his pocket, his eyes lingering on the screen for a moment before he returned to watching Mia. She had already finished her ice cream and was now spinning around in her seat, laughing as she did. James couldn't help but smile. Despite the incident earlier, his little girl, his little ray of sunshine, was unaffected. It was a reminder of how much he loved spending time with her, how important these simple moments were. Mia had always been his joy, his reason for fighting through the difficult moments in life. And he knew that, no matter how tough things got, he would always have her by his side. But the events of the day had left a mark on him, even if he wasn't showing it. He had been treated unjustly, and while the apology from Sam Richardson had been nice, it wasn't enough. It was just another reminder of how easily people could judge you based on the color of your skin or the way you dressed. It didn't matter that he was a kind, loving grandfather. What mattered to some people was the color of his skin, and that made him feel small, insignificant. His thoughts were interrupted by the sudden sound of a familiar voice. "James?" He looked up, startled, to see the woman from the jewelry store standing a few feet away, her eyes locked on him. She had been the one who had looked at him so curiously when he first entered the store with Mia. He hadn't expected to see her again. "Hello," James said politely, though he was unsure of her intentions. The woman smiled nervously, as if she were unsure of how to approach him. "I just wanted to apologize," she said quickly, her voice softer than before. "I don't know if I was clear earlier, but I'm sorry for the way the security guard treated you. It wasn't right. I didn't know who you were." James raised an eyebrow, surprised by her sudden apology. "It's okay," he said, though his tone was guarded. "It's not the first time something like this has happened." The woman looked pained, as if she didn't know how to respond to that. I felt so awkward when everything went down," she continued. "I wanted to step in, but I didn't know how. I should have done something." James nodded slowly, his gaze steady. "It's not easy to stand up when you see something wrong happening. Not everyone does it, but that doesn't make it right," he said, his voice calm but firm. The woman shifted her weight uncomfortably, clearly regretting her lack of action. "You're right," she said, her eyes meeting his with sincerity. "I just wanted to tell you that I'm sorry. I know an apology doesn't fix everything, but I wanted you to know that I regret how things went." James studied her for a moment, then nodded once, accepting her words, though they didn't erase what had happened. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I appreciate you coming over to say that." She offered a small smile, though it was laced with sadness, before she turned and walked away, leaving James alone with his thoughts once again. Mia was already on her feet, ready to move on to the next adventure. James, despite the weight on his heart, felt a sense of gratitude for her. She reminded him every single day that there was more to life than the small injustices that tried to pull him down. The afternoon wore on, and the mall slowly began to empty as the shadows of the late afternoon stretched across the floors. James glanced down at Mia, who was skipping ahead with her usual carefree energy, oblivious to the grown-up world around her. He couldn't help but feel a sense of peace when she was with him. Her laughter, her joy, these were the things that mattered most in his life. But even as he watched her, his mind kept returning to the events of the day. The incident with the security guard had shaken him, even though he hadn't shown it. He had dealt with racism his whole life, but the sting never quite went away. It wasn't something he could just forget, not when it felt like every day brought a new reminder. Mia stopped suddenly, pointing toward a store with wide eyes. "Look, Grandpa, I want to go there," she exclaimed, tugging at his hand. James followed her gaze and saw that she was eyeing a toy store, a colorful, bright place that was clearly designed to capture the attention of children. "All right, let's go take a look," he said with a smile, following her to the door. As they entered, the store was filled with the sound of cheerful music, and the shelves were packed with every toy imaginable: stuffed animals, dolls, building blocks, and even remote-controlled cars. Mia immediately ran toward the section with plush toys, her little hands reaching for a large teddy bear. James smiled at her excitement, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the conversation he'd had with the woman from the jewelry store. He hadn't expected her apology, and part of him wondered if it was enough. He had grown used to being overlooked, to being treated unfairly, but there was a part of him that still held on to the hope that things could change. that people could be better. Just as he was about to sit down on one of the benches near the entrance, his phone buzzed in his pocket again. This time, the message was from Linda. "Dad, are you all right? Call me when you can. I'm really worried." James took a deep breath, feeling the familiar pang of guilt. Linda was a good daughter, always looking out for him, always trying to make sure he was okay. But he hated worrying her. He didn't want to be a burden. He had spent so much of his life protecting her, taking care of everything, that it was hard for him to admit when he needed help. He quickly typed a response. "I'm fine. Don't worry. Just spending some time with Mia. We'll talk later." As he hit send, the sound of a familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. "James?" James froze. The voice was unmistakable. He looked up, and his heart skipped a beat. Standing in front of him was someone he hadn't seen in years, his old friend Charles from the neighborhood. Charles had been one of the few people James had trusted growing up. They had shared countless memories together, from their early days of playing basketball at the local court to their late-night conversations about life and dreams. But life had pulled them in different directions over the years, and they had lost touch. "Charles," James said, his voice filled with surprise. "I can't believe it's you." Charles, his face lighting up with a wide grin, stepped forward and gave James a warm hug. "It's been too long, man," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Way too long." James stepped back, taking in his friend's appearance. Charles looked a little older, his hair graying at the temples, but he still had that same infectious energy that James remembered. It was amazing how, even after all these years, they could pick up right where they left off. "I didn't know you were in town," James said, still stunned by the unexpected reunion. Charles shrugged, grinning. "I just moved back a few weeks ago. Got a job here, managing the mall's maintenance team. They told me you were here with your granddaughter, and I figured I'd stop by and say hello." James' heart warmed at the sight of his old friend. "Well, I'm glad you did," he said. "This is my granddaughter, Mia," he added, motioning toward the little girl who was still absorbed in picking out a teddy bear from the shelf. Mia looked up, her eyes wide as she saw Charles. "Hi, mister," she said, waving excitedly. Charles crouched down to her level, smiling. "Hey there, young lady. I'm Charles," he said, offering his hand. "You got a lot of toys in here, huh?" Mia nodded enthusiastically, her face lighting up as she held up her teddy bear for him to see. "This one is the biggest," she said proudly. Charles laughed. "I think that's a great choice. Can I get you something else? Maybe a toy car or a doll?" Mia giggled, shaking her head. "I like this one," she said firmly, hugging the bear close to her chest. James smiled at the exchange. He had always appreciated how Charles had been so good with kids. It was one of the things that had made him such a great friend back in the day. "So, what's been going on with you?" Charles asked, standing up and turning back to James. "How have you been?" "It's been way too long, man." James sighed, looking down at the floor for a moment. Same old, just trying to get by. It's not always easy, you know, but I've got Mia, and that makes everything better." Charles nodded understandingly. "I hear you. Things have been tough for a lot of people. But hey, we're still standing, right?" James gave a small smile. "Yeah, we are." There was a long pause, and for a moment they just stood there, taking in the comfortable silence. It felt good to be around someone who understood someone who had shared those tough years with him, someone who had been there when life felt uncertain. "So, what do you say we grab a coffee?" Charles said after a moment, his eyes bright with excitement. "I'd love to catch up more." James thought about it for a second and then nodded. "I'd like that." James and Charles made their way to the nearby cafe inside the mall, the sound of their footsteps echoing softly as they walked side by side. Mia, still clutching her giant teddy bear, skipped along happily, her little voice filled with chatter about the toys in the store. James smiled at her innocence, her joy in simple things reminding him of better times. The cafe was a quiet corner of the mall, tucked away from the hustle and bustle. A few customers sat at tables, sipping coffee and talking in low voices, but for the most part, it was a peaceful spot. Charles led the way to a small table by the window, where they could overlook the courtyard outside. Once they were seated, Charles immediately called over a server to order coffee. Mia, never one to miss out, asked for a hot chocolate with whipped cream. James couldn't help but laugh, reminding himself of all the times he had spoiled her with little treats. She was his world, and he would do anything to see her smile. "How's your daughter?" "Linda, right?" Charles asked, settling into his chair with a relaxed sigh. "You always talked about her so much when we were younger." "She's doing well," James replied, stirring his coffee. "Busy with work, but she's doing all right. She worries about me sometimes, though." He shook his head slightly, a small chuckle escaping his lips. "She thinks I'm getting too old to be out on my own." Charles smiled. "I get that, but you're still sharp as a tack, James. You've always been one to push through, no matter what life throws at you." James nodded, feeling a rush of gratitude for his old friend's words. "Yeah, well, some things never change." The server brought over their drinks, and Mia eagerly dug into her hot chocolate, her face lighting up at the whipped cream. "This is yummy, Grandpa," she exclaimed, causing both men to chuckle. "Good choice, Mia," James said, smiling warmly at her. Charles took a sip of his coffee, his expression shifting to something more serious. "So," he began, his voice lowering slightly, "tell me what happened today. I saw the way you handled that situation with the security guard. You were calm, but something was off. I could tell." James sighed deeply, setting his coffee cup down. He wasn't sure if he was ready to talk about it, but Charles was a friend and he trusted him. "It's the same thing, Charles. People still see me and think I'm less than. It's not always so obvious, but it's there. That security guard. He assumed I was a thief just because of the color of my skin. It's not the first time something like this has happened, but today..." His voice trailed off, and he looked down at his hands, trying to steady his emotions. Charles's eyes softened as he listened. "Man, I had no idea," he said quietly. "That's messed up. I mean, I know things are rough out here, but to have someone treat you like that, especially when you've done nothing wrong, it just isn't right." James nodded. "Yeah, and it's not just that incident. It's everywhere, all the time. Even now, when I walk into places like this mall, I wonder how people are going to look at me. It's exhausting." Charles leaned forward, his expression filled with concern. "You know, I've seen things like this too, but it seems like it's worse now, more obvious somehow. People don't even try to hide it anymore. That security guard, he should have known better. But you handled it well, James." James let out a slow breath. "I didn't have much choice. I had Mia with me, and I didn't want to make a scene. I've learned over the years that sometimes it's better to stay calm, to just let things play out. Charles looked at him, his face thoughtful. But how long can you keep doing that? How long can you just let things slide when it feels like you're constantly being pushed down? James stared out the window for a moment, his mind racing. He hadn't really asked himself that question before. He had always just dealt with it, always taken it in stride. But Charles was right. How long could he keep swallowing his anger? How long could he let people treat him like he was invisible? I don't know, James finally admitted, his voice low. But I have to keep going. For Mia. For my family. It's hard. But I don't want her growing up in a world where this kind of thing is normal. I want to be able to show her that there's more to life than just fighting back. Charles nodded, his face serious. I get it, and you're right. Mia's lucky to have you as her grandfather. You're showing her the right way to live, even if it feels like the world's against you. They sat in silence for a few moments, each lost in their own thoughts. James could feel the weight of the conversation, but at the same time, he felt a sense of relief. Talking about it with someone who understood felt like a small weight lifting off his shoulders. Just as he was about to say something more, Mia looked up from her hot chocolate, her eyes wide with excitement. Grandpa, look, it's the man from the store, the one who said sorry to you. James turned around, his heart skipping a beat as he saw the familiar figure of Mr. Bennett, the owner of the luxury jewelry store, walking toward their table. James stood up as Mr. Bennett approached, his heart still racing from the unexpected encounter. Mia, ever the curious one, tilted her head and looked up at him with innocent eyes. "Grandpa, do you know him?" she asked, still holding on to her teddy bear with both hands. James smiled at her and patted her head before turning his attention back to Mr. Bennett. "Yes, Mia, I know him," he said, his voice calm, though his thoughts were a whirlwind. Mr. Bennett stopped at their table, his face a mix of regret and determination. He looked directly at James, his eyes soft but filled with sincerity. "Mr. Davis," he began, his voice steady but carrying a tone of genuine apology. "I wanted to take a moment to apologize for what happened earlier today. What that security guard did was completely inappropriate, and I'm so sorry for the way he treated you." James didn't say anything right away, still processing the words. The apology felt almost surreal, considering the way he had been treated just an hour ago. He glanced at Charles, who gave him an encouraging nod, silently urging him to accept the apology. Mia, still wide-eyed, let go of her teddy bear and tugged on James' sleeve. "Grandpa, why was the man mean to you?" she asked, her innocent voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Mr. Bennett looked down at her, his expression softening further. "It was wrong of me to let that happen, young lady," he said, crouching down to her level. "I'm very sorry you had to see that." Mia simply nodded, her attention quickly shifting back to her hot chocolate, as if the conversation was already behind her. But James could see that it was a little different for her now. She might not fully understand the complexities of racism or injustice yet, but she was absorbing something important that she would carry with her as she grew up. James turned back to Mr. Bennett, a part of him still unsure about how to respond. "I appreciate the apology," he said slowly, his voice steady but laced with years of weariness. "But you know, apologies don't always change things. It's not just about today. It's about everything that's been happening for so long." Mr. Bennett nodded in understanding, his eyes full of empathy. "I know," he said quietly, "and I'm ashamed of it. What happened today is not something I can undo, but I can make sure it doesn't happen again. I'm taking steps to ensure that our staff is properly trained, that they understand the importance of treating everyone with respect, regardless of who they are or where they come from." James looked at him, still unsure if the words meant much. He had heard plenty of empty apologies in his time, promises of change that never came to fruition. But there was something about Mr. Bennett's demeanor that made James pause, something that felt more genuine than the usual corporate rhetoric. "I hope you're right," James said, his voice soft but firm. "I hope you follow through on those words. It's not enough to just say the right things. It's about actions, and those actions need to be consistent." Mr. Bennett nodded earnestly. "I understand, and that's why I wanted to personally come over and speak to you, Mr. Davis. I value your dignity, and I respect you. I'm the one who should have handled things better from the start." There was a long silence as James processed the apology. Part of him wanted to let it go, to move on, but another part of him couldn't help but feel the weight of years of injustice pressing down on him. It was hard to let it go, to simply accept that words could heal everything. Charles, sensing the tension, spoke up. "I think what James means is that actions speak louder than words, Mr. Bennett. We've all heard promises before. What matters now is what you do next." Mr. Bennett turned his gaze toward Charles, nodding in agreement. "You're absolutely right," he said. "And I'm committed to making sure this kind of thing never happens again, not just with James, but with anyone who comes through our doors. I'll be reviewing our procedures and making changes where necessary." James remained silent for a moment longer, then finally offered a small but genuine nod. "I'll take your word for it," he said, his tone a bit softer now. "But you've got to show people you mean it. That's the real test." Mr. Bennett stood up, looking at James with a sense of resolve. "I will. And thank you for your understanding, Mr. Davis. I just hope you can find it in yourself to forgive the way things were handled today." James looked down at Mia, who was now back to playing with her teddy bear. He thought about the way the world worked, the way people like him were too often judged by their skin color instead of their character. But in this moment, for the first time that day, he felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe things could change, even if just a little. "I'll think about it," James said finally, standing up and offering Mr. Bennett a handshake. "And I'll be watching. It's easy to forget, but I won't let it slide." Mr. Bennett smiled, taking his hand. "Thank you. You won't regret it." As the two men exchanged a firm handshake, Mia looked up at James with her bright eyes and innocent smile. "Grandpa, can we go to the toy store now?" James chuckled, feeling the tension of the day begin to lift. "Of course, Mia. Let's go pick out something nice." And with that, they walked out of the cafe, the afternoon light streaming through the windows. For a moment, the weight of the world seemed just a little lighter, and James allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could change one step at a time. The mall felt different now, after everything that had happened. It seemed almost surreal to walk through the grand halls, hearing the soft chatter of shoppers and the light hum of the elevator. The events of the day had left an indelible mark on James. But as he strolled beside Mia, his mind started to ease. Mia, oblivious to the heavy moments her grandfather had endured, skipped ahead, her tiny feet light on the polished floor. She hummed a little tune to herself, twirling around and grinning widely. James couldn't help but smile at her joy. It was a reminder of the innocence the world often robbed from people like him. People who had seen too much, lived through too much, to ever see things the way she did. As they reached the toy store, James paused to look around, the overwhelming variety of colors and shapes filling the space. Mia ran excitedly toward a shelf of plush toys, her eyes wide with wonder as she picked up a stuffed lion, holding it up for James to see. "Look, Grandpa, this lion is just like the one in my book," she exclaimed, her face lighting up with excitement. James crouched down to her level, his heart swelling with love and pride. "It sure is," he said gently. "You can pick any toy you like." Mia's eyes darted to the shelves once more, and in a moment of indecision, she grabbed a small teddy bear, holding it up triumphantly. "I want this one. Can I have it?" James chuckled and nodded. "Of course, sweetheart." He turned to the cashier, who greeted them with a warm smile, ringing up the bear without hesitation. The soft, familiar sound of the register's beep was a comfort, a reminder that despite all the wrongs in the world, there were still small moments of goodness. As they walked out of the toy store, James felt a sense of closure. The incident earlier, the injustice, the confrontation, it was all still fresh in his mind, but he could see the seed of change being planted. Mr. Bennet had meant what he said. There was sincerity in his words, and James had no intention of forgetting the promises made. It wasn't just about one incident. It was about creating a ripple effect, a change that could go beyond this one mall, this one encounter. Mia's laughter broke him out of his thoughts as she held her new teddy bear close to her chest, swinging it around as she danced. "Grandpa, I'm so happy," she beamed, her eyes sparkling. "I'm happy too, sweetheart," James said, looking down at her with a deep sense of gratitude. "But let's make sure we remember today, not just for the toy or the fun, but for the lessons we learned, for the change that's coming." Mia didn't fully understand, of course, but she seemed to grasp the simple truth behind his words. She didn't question the world the way adults did. She just accepted it with an open heart. They passed the security office on their way out of the mall, and James paused for a moment considering. The guard who had wrongfully accused him wasn't at the desk, but the memory of the confrontation still lingered. He wasn't angry anymore, but he had to wonder if others would always be treated as he had been. He knew the journey wasn't over. The changes Mr. Bennet promised would take time. Action spoke louder than words. But James had learned that even the smallest actions could set off a ripple, a chain reaction that had the power to alter the course of history. James looked down at Mia, who was happily chattering away about her new bear and what she would name it. His heart ached with the weight of what he had experienced, but it was also filled with hope for the future, for her future. "You know," James said as they walked hand in hand toward the parking lot, "today wasn't just about what happened with the security guard. It's about what happens next. It's about making sure people are treated with dignity, no matter who they are, no matter what they look like." Mia, still bouncing on her feet, looked up at him with wide eyes. "We're going to help them, right, Grandpa?" James smiled at her. "Yes, Mia, we're going to help." Together, as they drove home, James reflected on the course of the day. In that one moment, when Mr. Bennet had apologized, there was the chance for something more. Not just an apology, but a promise that maybe things didn't have to stay the same. It was a new beginning, not just for James, but for everyone who had been overlooked, mistreated, or misunderstood. The world wasn't perfect, but in small ways and with small steps, it could get better. Change was possible, even when it seemed out of reach. And for the first time in a long while, James allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, The world was finally ready to listen.